At the same time that Rococo was developing during the 18th century, or soon after its development, another artistic movement happened simultaneously, and in many ways in reaction to Rococo and the values of that, and this is called Neoclassicism. Neoclassicism simply means new classicism, so another return of classical influences, Greco-Roman influences, like we saw in the Renaissance, but in a different guise this time around. So, two paintings side by side, a Rococo painting on the left and a neoclassical painting on the right. Pause the presentation and look at them closely to see what kinds of differences and similarities you can notice between them. Okay, so looking at the painting on the left, it's a typical Rococo painting, frothy nature, emphasis on playfulness, some eroticism with the little Cupid on the left putting its finger up to its mouth to say, don't tell anyone about what's going on. One suitor pulling the swing and another one hiding in the bushes to look up the skirts of his beloved. All about playfulness, eroticism, aristocracy. On the right-hand side, we have a much more serious scene, and in a very different style. This is David's painting of the scene from the Iliad in which Andromache mourns the death of her husband Hector, who's died defending the city of Troy. You can see his sculptural form, the classical architecture with the pillars in the back, the sculptural setting of the whole thing. In many ways, it seems like not so much like a frozen moment, but as a staged scene. Her look of sadness on her face is regal and dignified, and everything is controlled. And it's a much more serious message. This is about the costs of country, the costs of loyalty. Hector has died in defense of his country, of his city. And so it's a recognition of duty. And although that duty comes with sadness, he's died a hero's death. So neoclassicism is based in history, both in terms of style and in terms of subject matter, but both the style and the subject matter have everything to do with 18th century Europe and the kinds of ideas and values that are circulating. We're going to look first at music, and with the most famous of classical composers, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart was known as a Wunderkind, a child prodigy. 50-year-old Haydn told Mozart's father about the young child, "Before God and as an honest man, I tell you that your son is the greatest composer known to me." And Mozart was, in his 20s at most at this time. Because of his travels as a child performer through Europe, he assimilated a wide range of influences. And Mozart is famous not just because he created so much music, but because his music speaks to people over the centuries and seems to encapsulate so much of human experience. The piece that we're going to talk about is in sonata form, and sonata form is the central form of classical music. Now, by classical music, I mean music that is composed in the 18th century neoclassical movement. Classical music has taken on a meaning to represent all music that's not jazz, hip-hop, top 40, R&B, rap, all the other kinds of popular music. But in its time, classical music was popular music. So classical music, as we're going to talk about it now, is specifically the music that was composed during this time period. And like so much classical art, it's very form-based. Like the David painting that we saw, Mozart's music relies on established forms and works within those forms, often in very innovative ways to send a message. So this sonata form that is used so often in classical music has three major parts: an exposition or presentation of a theme, a development in which the themes, the two major themes, are broken apart, combined in interesting ways, and then a recapitulation in which those two themes are reconciled to each other. They're brought into the same key. The whole form moves from chaos to order, from discord to concord. And then there's often a coda, a short ending section to wrap things up. The sonata form uses cadences or closing sections of music to let us know when each passage is done. So the piece we're going to listen to a little bit of is Mozart's Symphony Number 40 in G minor, the fourth movement, the last part. Symphonies are divided generally into movements, and these just mean sections. And if you've ever been at a symphony or a concert where people don't clap when the music stops, it's probably because you traditionally don't clap between movements because they're all part of one piece. Now, this symphony, number 40, was one of Mozart's later symphonies and one of three that he composed within a 2-month period, which is incredible and gives you a sense of Mozart's great ability, his genius. It's written in a minor key, which means that it has a feeling of sadness or mysteriousness or heaviness to it, as opposed to a major key, which tends to be more cheerful and happy. And Albert Einstein called this movement, as well as the first movement of the symphony, plunge into the abyss of the soul. And some people speculate it's because of the difficulties Mozart was going through in his life at this time, but at the same time that he composed this, he composed some very cheery works. So classical music is not autobiographical, does not tend to give across the emotions of the composer. Classical arts are not self-revelatory in the way that romantic arts are going to be, which we're going to talk about later. Although they have passion and emotion, it's a universal passion and emotion that everyone can relate to. Unlike Baroque music, there is no fugue form. It's a new kind of form, and the instrumentation is much more restricted in this later symphony of Mozart's. And another thing, as this little passage of music might show you at the bottom, those of you who read music, is that he experimented radically with a sense of key as he's breaking apart these themes, experimented with what music can do. So we're going to listen to this first theme, the Mozart's in the Closet theme, and hear how that first theme is presented in the exposition. And you have this whole movement on your CD and on your Blackboard site to listen to. Another important accomplishment of Mozart's was his contribution to the development of opera. Now, opera began as a Baroque form, as we talked about in the Baroque period. By the classical period, opera has become very popular, not just for courts, but for more classes of people to come visit. And not all operas are tragedies anymore. There are comedies as well, lighter opera. And one of Mozart's most famous operas is The Marriage of Figaro, which was based on a play by a French writer named Beaumarchais. And it was interpreted as an attack on the morals of the ruling class and a warning that the lower class would fight back, which in 1786 were pretty close to the French Revolution, and they did fight back in France. And the interesting thing about this is that the aristocracy doesn't come across looking so good. It's a social critique. But all the characters in Mozart's opera are very human. They embody the range of human experience, and so it's not so much about personal emotion as it's about societal experience. The play itself moves from chaos to order like sonata form. The problems of the beginning of the play are finally resolved in the finale, which is called Pace Pace, which is peace. And I've put a clip of this part of the opera on our Blackboard site so that you can see the way that it's resolved musically and thematically and emotionally. Now, we already looked at a painting by Jacques-Louis David at the beginning of this lecture. I want to give a little more information about him because he was one of the foremost creators of Neoclassicism. And he was called the Robespierre of the brush because of his service to the French Revolution through his art, that his art served as a sort of propaganda, that it promoted a new kind of patriotism that challenged the ruling of the aristocracy. So one of David's most famous works is the Oath of the Horatii. And you can see, I hope that this is a classical painting by many things in it. First of all, the classical architecture in the background. This is not an outdoor scene. This is not frothy nature. Simple background, simple composition. The figures look like frozen statues. So this is not a Baroque painting in which the movement seems to just have paused. This seems very staged, very sculpturesque. He uses linear perspective to create a sense of depth. And he balances the two sides of the painting. On the one hand, we have the three brothers who are swearing allegiance to their family, to the cause of their family, to go fight those who have become their enemies. And on the right-hand side, we see the women who are mourning because the ones that are going to be killed are going to be their brothers or husbands or brothers-in-law. And so you see again the costs of duty. But the painting's message overall is one of patriotism, of bravery, of doing what is right, whatever the costs may be. Now, depending on who you are, you might have a different opinion of what is right. David has a specific one here in mind, and this becomes a rallying cry for the French Revolution and the causes that it espouses. Now, another neoclassical painting is this one by Sir Joshua Reynolds, which is much more lighthearted, but I wanted you to see this because of the way that it makes use of classical sculptural forms. On the lower right of the slide, you can see three women's forms from the Parthenon, which is a famous Greek building. And Joshua Reynolds has borrowed this idea of moving upward into a half triangle from classical art. And so you get that statuesque calmness like the Parthenon statues, and it also brings some of the dignity, some of the timelessness of those classical works to a contemporary scene. Here, three girls getting ready for the marriage of one of them. In architecture, neoclassicism is easy to find. If you just look at downtown Boise at our state capitol, it's in a neoclassical form, as are so many of the buildings of U.S. government. Classicism communicates, well, if you were in front of me, I would ask you what you think classicism communicates. To me, it communicates timelessness, stability, order, reason. And you can see this in the Paris Pantheon on the left, which began as a church but soon became a tomb for the philosophes, the thinkers whose reasoning and ideas led to the French Revolution. On the right, you've got Thomas Jefferson's creation of the Virginia State Capitol. And again, these geometric forms, triangles, circles, stable forms with pillars, with Greek and Roman columns, communicate those ideals, those classical ideals that are trying to be resurrected through neoclassicism. A literary recreation of these classical ideals comes through the Declaration of Independence. And I'm going to read through this first section, which many of you might have memorized, and then we'll talk about the Enlightenment or 18th century neoclassical ideals that it communicates. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. It all sounds very reasonable, very rational, very organized, very cerebral. Thomas Jefferson here is talking about rebellion. He's talking about war. This is a passionate topic, but the way that he approaches it is very neoclassical, very much in the Enlightenment way of thinking, which is ordered, rational, intellectual. And he bases this on self-evident truths, that people have these rights. So a belief in the rationality of these ideas. And this is heavily indebted to the ideas of John Locke, who argued for natural rights. And it buys into the idea that that government should be rationally based, that we don't act based on emotion or passion, but we act based on thought and principle, which are central to the neoclassical ideas. Now, some artists and writers use neoclassical ideals to poke fun at the way that society was not living up to those ideals. And one example of this is Hogarth's series, Marriage à la Mode, which shows a merchant class girl with money who is married to a poor aristocrat with a title, not a marriage for love, a marriage for title, a marriage for wealth, in which both of them live lives of dissolution and following their passions and not reining themselves in with reason. And in this scene, shortly after the marriage, you can see that the couple have both been partying all night. The woman's been at home playing cards with her friends, and the man's been out doing something. He's got some lady's cap in his pocket, and his sword is broken on the ground. which has numerous meanings, I think. And their accountant here is on the left, running out with a barrel of bills, with a handful of bills, just wondering how he's going to deal with this. And so Hogarth is using the principles of neoclassicism as a satire, as a way of making fun of people in order to foment change. And the same use of satire is evident in Jonathan Swift's writing, A Modest Proposal, which you have at the end of your chapter. And if you haven't read it yet, pause this presentation, read through A Modest Proposal, and then come back, because I don't want to give anything away for you. Okay, so if you're listening now, you've read A Modest Proposal, you know what it's talking about. And Swift, again, is using neoclassicism to critique society, to ask for something better, for change. So his main point seems to be that people should eat the children of poor people, that that's the way to solve all the problems in the world. Now, that makes Jonathan Swift sound like a terrible person. At the bottom of page 254 in your text, he says, I grant that this food will be somewhat dear and therefore very proper for landlords, who, as they've already devoured most of the parents, seem to have the best title to the children. And I think this is a point where it's very clear that Swift is satirizing the actions of the rich against the poor, that because they have devoured the poor already through their unkindness, lack of charity, bad economic practices, he says, what's the difference if we just eat them outright? So his actual main point is not that we should be eating young children of poor people, but rather that a society has to change, that we have to find a better way to take care of each other, and that in an enlightened society with people who can think and reason, there should be none of this figurative eating of each other. So satire in Swift's Modest Proposal uses reason to critique the unreasonableness of so many actions, that if people have minds and use them, that society really can be better than it is. So neoclassical arts are based on Greco-Roman art and architecture. They emphasize reason and order. They emphasize clarity, singable melodies, readable text, understandable art. They're more serious than Rococo, but much less religious than Baroque. They focus on form and structure, whether that be the sonata form in music, classical themes in art, classical architectural forms, classical argument forms in writing, like Jonathan Swift uses. And they're created still largely for aristocratic patrons who have money, but they appeal to a growing middle-class audience, and that growing middle-class audience is going to be the group that really foments change and uses these neoclassical ideals to create some radical changes in the Western world.